Personalist pedagogy and Catholic higher education. For some time now, education has been a central theme of Pope Francis's pontificate. In a concerted way, this began in September of 2019, when Francis spoke at the launch of a process at the Vatican to create a new global compact on education. This compact, he said, will promote an education that integrates and respects all aspects of the person. It will place the human person at the center of education and be based on a sound anthropology. It will contribute to the long-term vision of creating a new humanism and challenging the throwaway culture criticized in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. Drafting of the compact was scheduled to start in May of 2020, but the pandemic. Later that year, in October, the Vatican held a relaunch of the process. Speaking there, Francis again emphasized the human person in the first of 7 commitments he makes. A commitment that is to make human persons in their value and dignity the center of every educational program. Now, for anyone familiar with Catholic thought over the past century, this kind of talk about the human person might be so familiar as to seem kind of anodyne, just a Catholic way of speaking. But we do well to pause, I think, and to ask some questions, faced as we are with Francis's clearly intentional emphasis on this category of the person. What does it mean, concretely, to make the person the center of an educational program? If Francis is doing more here than just speaking Catholic, as we might reasonably suppose he is, what is he calling for? So that's our question for today. I want to make a start at answering these questions by revisiting the work of Jacques Maritain, an influential French Catholic philosopher of the 20th century, whose work did much to shape the intellectual movement in Catholic thought known as personalism. And this movement was the subject of my own dissertation some years ago. We'll examine some defining themes of Maritain's philosophy of education as presented in 2 works in his Terry Lectures at Yale, published in 1943 as Education at the Crossroads, and in his book of 1962, The Education of Man. I'm drawing from both of these works, and I'll just kind of go back and forth between them. I'll offer some responses to the questions above and make a start at sketching the meaning of Francis's vision of education as expressed in those recent statements, keeping an eye always on our work at Albertus and in Catholic higher education more generally. So after some remarks on the historical context and motivations of Maritain's work, which will be important to kind of get at what he's, what is he driving at, I'll examine 2 running themes in his philosophy of education. First, his understanding of the aims of education. So what are the learning objectives? And second, some features of what I'm calling his personalist pedagogy. In conclusion, I'll say a bit about what all this means for us working in Catholic higher education today. So, to the history. A single phrase is often taken as the watchword of Maritain's philosophy of education: integral education for an integral humanism. So this idea of integration is important for Maritain, as it was for many Catholic thinkers of his generation, and his treatment of it has done much to influence subsequent Catholic thought. For example, we'll recall that Pope Paul VI, citing Maritain in a footnote, called for the integral development of developing societies. Francis, likely with Paul and Maritain in mind, has called for an integral ecology and insisted prominently for years that everything is connected. But we might ask here, what is an integral education? What problem is this kind of education meant to solve? What's driving it? And why all this emphasis on integration to begin with? So to answer these questions, I want to take a little historical detour. We can say this, starting with this idea of integration. Integration is felt to be needed by these authors because they see modern societies as fragmented, right? In Maritain's phrase. Or if we like, we can say differentiated in the more neutral sense proposed by the sociologist Max Weber. As societies have grown in complexity, community, Weber's Gemeinschaft, has given way to mass society, his Gesellschaft. The organic unity of familiar human relations has yielded to more impersonal and alienating modes of interaction. For a contemporary instance of this concern, recall Francis's criticism of what he calls the technocratic paradigm in Laudato Si and elsewhere. Francis acknowledges that this paradigm or way of seeing has indeed borne much fruit across many spheres of human activity, leading to unprecedented technological developments and economic growth. Yet its cost, he thinks, has been unacceptable, so much so that we need a new paradigm, and Francis calls it integral ecology. That's his answer. This will combat the ills of technocratic thinking while hopefully preserving its gains. All right. From these comments about integration, we can turn to the idea of the person, right? As developed within the personalist movement, Catholic emphasis on the person can be read as an effort to achieve the same end that we're talking about with integration, to reckon with the costs of modern fragmented societies without undoing modernity itself. From the French Revolution, 1793, all the way up to the end of the 19th century, one can call Catholic responses to the modern world nostalgic, right? Many Catholics wanted to recover pre modern, even medieval forms of life, to go back to a time before the modern world. The return to the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, called for by Leo XIII in his Eterni Patris of 1879, is representative of this impulse. By the 1930s, however, a shift had occurred. And Maritain, himself a prominent Thomist as well as a personalist, was at the forefront of this shift. Rather than undo modernity, go back to the Middle Ages, right? At the unacceptable cost of scrapping the many gains of the modern world, we might start, Maritain thought, from where we are. Start from that condition of fragmentation, differentiation, and from there try almost surgically to reassemble the fragments of our societies in such a way as to preserve the gains while reducing the costs. Social differentiation then would not be rolled back, but various spheres of society would be, you guessed it, integrated, right? Yielding new, call them integral approaches in various disciplines. And we would see, in short, how everything is connected. And that's Francis's phrase. In the same way, modern affirmations of the self, individual human rights, right? These would not be rejected as they had been consistently throughout the 19th century, right? Human rights was the big problem for Pius IX, for example. Rather, these modern commitments to the individual would be recast as an affirmation of the integrated whole human person. Unlike the atomized individual of modernity, the person would have both rights and responsibilities. She would have a commitment to the common good. Rather than facing head on, then, the project of integrating entire societies, these personalists, like Maritain, called for the personal integration first of each individual. This new aim, in addition to being more serviceable in the context of dialogue between the church and modern societies, had the benefit of harmonizing with a lot of trends in culture at that time, including existentialism, interest in personal authenticity, developments in phenomenology and philosophy, as well as the discourse of human rights, which of course became so important after 1948. And Maritain was himself among the drafters of the Declaration of Human Rights. In this way, we can begin to explain the curious fact that the Catholic Church, the strongest opponent of human rights throughout the 19th century, became their strongest advocate in the 20th century. All right. All right, so let's keep in mind this whole story. We've had integration, we've had the person, we've had the kind of motivation behind his project and some historical context. Now we can go back to our main thread, which is education. For Maritain, we can say, in his philosophy of education, education has two essential aims. The first, he says, pertains to the student's integration as a person, thinking of that in the context of the story we just told. Second, the essential aim is to prepare for a career and responsible citizenship. Both of these aims are essential. Maritain's a Thomist. That means something, right? But also they're ordered. So the first essential aim is to create conditions for the student to integrate the various aspects of herself as a person. This includes her body and spirit, but also an overcoming of contradictory ways of thinking and unhealthy patterns of willing. From a condition of fragmented manyness over time and in different ways at different times, the student is guided to develop an integrated sense of her own personal identity. The student herself, not the teacher, is the primary agent of education. The student is the primary agent of her own education. I lost my thread because I was emphasizing the point. For only the student can effect this integration in freedom for herself, by herself. The teacher, the curriculum, any kind of educational program you put in place, this can only serve as a guide for that primary agent, for the student. As Maritain puts it, education is meant to guide man in the evolving dynamism through which he shapes himself as a person. Education is in this respect a human awakening, an awakening that is to one's interior life and to truth and goodness and beauty. Education thus helps the student attain full formation or personal completeness. The student is made more human by the disciplines and objects of her study, insofar as these convey the spiritual fruit and achievements of the labor of generations, and deal with things which are worth being known for their own sake, for the sake of truth or the sake of beauty. That's Maritain. The humanities are called the humanities, then, we can say, not because in them we study humanity, but because through them we ourselves are made more human. The second essential aim of education, to prepare for a career in citizenship. This is not subordinate to the first in terms of its importance. It's also essential, right? But Maritain seems to say, if you want this way, seek ye first personal integration, and the rest will be added unto you, right? Put otherwise, lead a student to be awakened to a sense of her own freedom and intellect, responsibility, rootedness in culture, and she will, by natural extension, seek to contribute to her society. Parenthetically, it's worth noting that this does not work the other way around. Vocational training on its own does not integrate the personality. And this we'll see as the importance of the liberal arts in Catholic higher education. Here, Maritain acknowledges the advances brought about by modern theories of education, which have tended to focus education on practical life and the needs of society. Uh, John Dewey, other modern philosophers of education, they did away with the bookish kind of elitist approaches of the past, God and the Greeks. And for Maritain, this was to the good, even if he takes exception to such theories in most other respects. It's notable that Maritain insists throughout both of the works that we're considering that the kind of education for freedom that we're talking about here, right, liberal education, must be made, quote, available to all. Right? He regarded this as an indispensable precondition of democratic self-government, of which he was a vigorous advocate, and a claim which resounds clearly in its importance today. All right, so we have considered these aims of education clearly with a focus on the individual student. But remember, for Maritain, integral education is for an integral humanism. His ultimate aim, right, is to transform and renew our cultures and our societies. So, as he could say in 1943, in the belly of the war, the individualism, this is a quote, the individualism of the bourgeois era should be replaced not by totalitarian or sheer collectivism of the beehive, but by a, here it comes, personalistic and communal civilization grounded on human rights and satisfying the social aspirations and needs of man. So recall our story above here. We can say that this personalistic and communal civilization, this is Maritain's alternative to that return to a kind of medieval Christendom, right? That earlier critics of modernity wanted to see. This kind of civilization, personalistic communal civilization, is characterized by Maritain vividly in another one of his works called Integral Humanism, 1936. In confronting the crises of the modern world, he says there, and he uses a really vivid image. He says, we must think of ourselves as an army of stars thrown into the sky, not a fortified castle built in the middle of the land, right? Here we have an ecclesiology. Persons educated in the integral manner Maritain calls for will be equipped to play the role of these stars, right? Not establishing a fixed and defensive alternative to a fragmented modern world, secular culture, but guiding that world along new and more authentic pathways by the invisible network of their combined light. Okay, last section on pedagogy here. Our focus so far has been on the students themselves. We can say, in the language of our time, the learning outcomes, right, that Maritain proposes. So we can now turn to the specific role of the teacher, relevant for many of us, or what I'm calling Maritain's personalist pedagogy. He doesn't use that term. I think he should have, but he didn't. We can start from a simple question. If the student is and has to be the primary agent of her own education, what is left for the teacher to do? Well, Maritain puts it this way. He says, teaching is an art, and the teacher is an artist. But the teacher is not like a sculptor who works with a passive clay, right? The teacher's art is more akin to medicine. And here's the only block quote in the paper. Maritain, medicine deals with a living being that possesses inner vitality and the inner principle of health. The doctor exerts real causality in healing a sick man, yes, but in a very particular manner, by imitating the ways of nature herself in her operations, and by helping nature, by providing an appropriate diet and remedies that nature herself uses. In other words, medicine is an art of cooperating with nature, an ars cooperativa naturae, right? An art of ministering, an art subservient to nature, and so is education, end quote. Skilled in this cooperation with nature, the teacher establishes conditions under which the student can achieve her own awakening and integration. The teacher rather, pays a sort of, quote, sacred and loving attention to the student's mysterious identity, which is a hidden thing that no technique can reach. The teacher encourages. She never humiliates. She is ready at hand with the lessons of logic and reasoning that invite to action the student's unexercised reason. Everything the teacher teaches, she ensures, is in the student, quote, actively transformed by understanding into the very life of the mind, thus strengthening the latter as wood thrown into fire makes the fire stronger. It's a very beautiful image, I think. In one place in Crossroads, Maritain neatly enumerates 4 rules of education for the teacher. This will fill the balance of this section for us. So the first and primary rule he stresses is that the teacher should support the student's liberation by fostering in her certain fundamental dispositions which enable the principal agent, the student, to grow in the life of the mind. Among these, he includes a love of truth, the good, and justice, a sense for the value of cooperation, and what he calls a simplicity and openness to existence. I like that last one. This latter is described beautifully as the attitude of a being who exists gladly, is unashamed of existing, stands upright in existence, and for whom to be and to accept the natural limitations of existence are matters of equally simple assent. Maritain. The second rule is that the teacher should respect the so-called pre-conscious spiritual dynamism of the human personality and lay stress on inwardness and the internalization of what is being taught. The goal is never merely to convey information or conventions, right? These are means, they're not ends. The goal is to liberate this inner dynamism in the student. Two examples. One, of teaching writing, Maritain says, and both of these are great. You'll love these. Before giving a youth the rules of good style, let us tell him first never to write anything which does not seem to him beautiful, whatever the result may be. And of reading. In asking a youth to read a book, let us get him to undertake a real spiritual adventure and meet and struggle with the internal man instead of glancing over a collection of bits of thoughts and dead opinions according to the horrible custom of what they call being informed. Oh, I love that. With the third rule, we return to the theme of integration. The whole work of education, Maritain writes, and teaching must tend to unify and not to spread out. It must strive to foster internal unity in man. Now, by internal unity, it's important to know he doesn't just mean the mind and mental pursuits, right? This would develop just one little piece of the student's person and not create the conditions for their real integration. Here and elsewhere, Maritain stresses the importance of actually manual labor and experiential learning at all stages of education, right through college. The better to overcome, he says, the cleavage between homo faber and homo sapiens, man the doer and man the thinker. Fourth and finally, the teacher should, in effect, worry less about how much she teaches and worry more about how she teaches it. Maritain writes, teaching must liberate intelligence instead of burdening it. It must free the mind through the mastery of reason over the things learned. The goal is to occasion this mastery, not to fill up the student's mind. Teaching, he writes, at the undergraduate level should be concentrated on awakening the minds of students to a few basic intuitions or intellectual perceptions in each discipline, so that what is illuminating as to the truth of things learned is definitely and unshakably possessed. This would, he says, lead to a rise in the quality of teaching and alleviation of the material burden imposed by the curriculum. In concluding this section on Maritain's personalist pedagogy, I'd be remiss not to mention, this is a fun part, be remiss not to mention his remarks on the personal life of the teacher herself, expressing his concern about the lack of integration in the minds of teachers themselves. He suggests the formation of study clubs and seminars in which teachers belonging to various disciplines and departments would meet together on a voluntary basis to discuss basic problems relevant to the unity of knowledge. Sounds very grand, right? In this way, he says, fresh and quickening blood would circulate in the campuses, and yet such an initiative could obviously succeed only if teachers had the necessary free time. That is to say, if they were not faced with a much too heavy number of teaching hours. For it is preposterous to ask people who lead an enslaved life to perform a task of liberation. Ha! Love that? All right, conclusion. So in conclusion, let's go back to our main question at the top, right? What does it mean concretely to make human persons the center of an educational program? I have proposed that by revisiting Maritain's personalist philosophy of education, it's a good way to start answering that question. And we've sketched some defining features, a little in review. The student herself, we have seen, for Maritain, is the primary agent of her own education. Her task is not primarily to acquire information or skills. That's included. It's important, right? But her main task is to allow her faculties to be awakened according to their nature and for her inner life to acquire some shape. We have here, I submit, a sound basis for the promotion and preservation of the liberal arts in Catholic colleges and universities. Importantly, not just as a kind of general commitment to providing students with a well-rounded education, right? For Maritain presents this essential aim of education as part of a larger and very Catholic effort, right, to overcome the fragmentation of our modern societies, while in the same gesture celebrating and preserving their many gains. In Maritain's work, we thus find a rationale for treating the liberal arts as an essential part of the mission of Catholic institutions, as Catholic institutions, right? The liberal arts are expressive of these institutions' specifically Catholic identity. The teacher, as we've seen, On the other side is a minister of this process of awakening on the part of the student. The teacher, she merely creates the conditions for this process to unfold. She accompanies the student. She seeks to model in what measure she can the life of the mind. As distinct from other more modern philosophies of education, Maritain regards the adventure of education as beholden always to something beyond and above both student and teacher, to goodness, to truth, to beauty, and no less, in Maritain's own case, to God. Again, there is in this characterization of the teacher's task something distinctively Catholic, right? Not in the narrow or confessional sense, for it seems to echo the account of education proposed by Augustine in his De Magistro, 389. Augustine's view echoes throughout the Middle Ages and invites our attention today. In short, Augustine's view, the teacher does not teach, right? Rather than teach in the sense of conveying information, the teacher works properly by a kind of anamnesis, by prompting the student. She seeks to awaken the student to a consciousness of and strengthened commitment to the student's own objects of ultimate concern, her own highest values or aims, and to challenge the student in ever new ways to assess and interrogate those objects, encouraging her toward her own highest and fullest possibilities. The student helps enable this consciousness, the teacher helps enable this consciousness and commitment to drive the student in her studies and encourages her to take ownership of her education and indeed of her life. So, last paragraph. Here we have a vision of the aims and means of Catholic higher education that is at once both robustly Catholic and robustly pluralist, or if you like, personalist. We are invited to think of Catholic colleges and universities in a new way, not as fortified castles in the middle of the land, bulwarks against secular culture, and not as generically values-based alternatives to non-Catholic institutions. Rather, we're invited to think of a Catholic college as a pluralistic community of persons, engaged in a shared adventure of self-discovery, and oriented always toward what is of ultimate concern beyond themselves, however diversely conceived the objects of that concern might be. As the American church grapples with factionalism and division, we might be so bold as to propose this personalist vision of Catholic higher education as the real, authentically Catholic possibility for our times. Francis's commitment to make human persons the center of an educational program appears in this respect not as a case of his conceding ground to secular culture, as his critics may allege. Rather, it appears as a legitimate development of a Catholic personalist mode of response to that same culture, an effort to mobilize an army of stars to help effect its healing and renewal. Thank you.